I want to welcome everybody back. I think we're ready to start our next session. There may be one or two more people in the hallway, but we're going to go ahead and start. Before we begin, I want to note that next weekend there is no seminar because it's the Memorial Day weekend. But the following weekend, on June the 3rd, there will be another morning dialogue seminar. It's called Digging Down and Going Up: The New York City Subway and the Airplane in the Transportation Revolution. And we have two speakers, one talking about the development of trains and subways in New York, Fred Naden, a professor of history, and we have Greg Seltzer, who is also a historian of France and an independent scholar, who will talk about the sky hopes to jet-lagged folks. From sky hopes to jet-lagged folks, the Wright brothers, and the takeoff of modern flight. His name is Greg Seltzer, and he actually has a very close connection with our next speaker. They met in France. Do you mind if I tell her? I'm not going to tell a romantic story, but I have said that amazing magic and imagined communities take place in France, and Kylie met her husband in the National Archives or Library of Paris. It's imaginable. It's unimaginable. Anyway, that's on June 3rd, and then the following week, June 10th, we have a program on pirates and piracy and the role of piracy in modern history. That will include also an expert on Eastern North Carolina, Charles Ewan, who is at East Carolina, and our colleague Max Orr. But now I want to move into our session. Our speaker for this session is Dr. Kylie Seltzer, who, as I mentioned before, is the Zetlow Postdoctoral Fellow. She's very involved in developing our new civic engagement project at Carolina Public Humanities. She's the first director of that program. Kylie grew up in Minnesota, and she received her BA degree in art history and in French and Italian studies at the University of Minnesota. And then she moved on to Pittsburgh to work on a PhD in the history of art and architecture at the University of Pittsburgh. And she brilliantly completed and defended her doctorate as the pandemic was developing in early 2020. And there were not a lot of options, and she stayed on in Pittsburgh, but she had a very important position there working for a nonprofit organization called Common Cause Consultants, which assists historically marginalized groups in Pittsburgh to protect and build their communities. But she moved back to North Carolina. Not back, she moved to North Carolina. I should mention one other thing about her husband. He grew up in North Carolina. She was not Tar Heel born or Tar Heel bred, but she is Tar Heel wed and not Tar Heel dead. Do you follow all that? Okay. In any case, her dissertation focuses on ideas about racial and cultural identities in late 19th century Paris. She's published essays on this subject, but she's especially interested in how humanists can interpret their work far beyond academic communities, and she believes that humanistic knowledge should connect with key public issues, such as in education or the meaning of nationalism in the modern world. In short, we are extremely pleased that Kylie has joined our team at Carolina Public Humanities and is working on this civic engagement project. And she's going to draw on her historical research today for her talk on building the City of Light, how Paris became the capital of the 19th century. Please welcome Kylie Seltzer.
Friends. Okay, we'll see. Can you hear me? Do I need to move it or does it need to be louder? Can you hear me? I'm excited, and so I want to make sure it's quiet now, because if we get more excited, I'll get more loud. And you know, since you gave honest you're gonna have an amazing. And here I am now with the luck of being able to call these fine folks my colleagues, and I'm so glad to be here with you. And again, many of you know me within the context of the Civic Engagement Project, and it is an absolute delight to be able to share my passion, my fascination, my curiosity for 19th century French art and architecture, since this is one of the running true loves of my life. This has been a thread throughout most of my adolescence and young adulthood. So thank you for taking the time on this fine Saturday to be here. So my talk is interrogating a real central question, which is, what is French art and architecture? Lloyd said it so beautifully in his talk, the ways that in order to have one identity, you must also have a counter identity in order to really figure out what are the qualities of the primary identity. And in France, there is a very strict idea about what French art, architecture, sculpture, and etching is. In fact, from the 17th century, you have these academies that were backed by royalty that set out a set of standards that said, if you are to be a creator, to be an artist, there's a few principles that you must follow in order to be chief among these is respect and veneration and reproduction of ancient and Renaissance artworks, really looking at history and innovating it to make it better. You're going to the Louvre as a student and you are just reproducing the Grand Masters over and over again. Innovation is not necessarily, a very clear innovation is not necessarily the goal. But of course, as Lloyd has pointed out, with every question, there is the counter, the shadow, the negative space, which is what is not French art and architecture. And we have a clear list of priorities and qualities, what falls outside of that, and what happens when these two things become in conversation, in dialogue, and in tension. And so throughout the talk today, we're really going to be thinking about the ways of how folks have preserved certain aspects of art and architecture while also looking beyond to other traditions, other practices of making in order to create their own art and objects. So we are in 2023, and if you want to see artwork, it is very easy. You can go to a museum, you can go to a gallery, you can pull out that little computer in your pocket and just Google it, right? It's not hard to actually interact with art objects. This was not always the case, especially in the 18th century. By the mid-19th century, you do have a broader culture of museums and public art, but before then, you really only had one opportunity a year to see art objects, and that is the salon, or the salon. And so you, as an aspiring art student, you have studied with these professors, you have learned to model what the Grand Masters of the Renaissance have done before you, and you are meant to create one of four types of paintings. Okay, there's very strict genre hierarchy here. So number one is you want to create a history painting. If you want real acclaim and you really want to get patronage, history. So it could be a mythical scene, it could be a battle scene, but it's something with historical significance that typically relates to nation making. Second genre is a portraiture, okay? So if you're making a portrait, you want it to capture the likeness, lots of attention to how the person presents in real life, the textures of their hair, of their clothing, of their environment, focusing on a person of esteem, right? We don't care about the random person on the street, it is someone with a name. Third, you have landscape, right? I mean, we are interested in the natural environment, but much less so. And then last is still life, okay? So you are trying to be strategic as an artist, because when you have the opportunity to submit to the salon, it will not only allow you to potentially become one of these tastemakers at the national level to decide what is good art and what is not good art, but also you want commissions. This is where the public learns about you. This is where the people who could support you come into contact with your artwork. Now, if we pause for a second, I want to just actually pick apart this image. And we're going to be doing a lot of close looking in my session. This is one of the key differences between me as a historian of art and architecture and traditional history, which is we really prioritize the art object as conveying information. So right away, you're going to see there's so many people here, right, in this scene. Tons and tons of folks. And it's not a quiet scene. There's folks looking up and around, they're talking, they're clustering together, and the room is almost packed. The salon on a yearly basis would get literally hundreds of thousands of visitors, right? This is a huge event for the public to interact with art objects. And this is no white box art gallery. This is no sacred space. We have to be quiet. In fact, if you submitted a painting and it was not liked, it was accepted but not liked, you would be openly mocked, right? So even if you were accepted, that doesn't necessarily mean that your career is made from that point on. The public is harsh, and the public has access to all of these critics who are very willing to share what they think and why you should think what they have already perceived about this painting. Now, again, you've been accepted, this is good news, except you go, you're like, great, where's my painting? You open the livret, the little book that lists all the paintings with their title, the artist. You're like, okay, 776. So you go and you find, and you're all the way up here. You're all the way at the top. Like, I mean, this is a 20-foot ceiling. So you just spent the whole year making a painting, nobody can see it, and all that detail that you put in, doesn't matter. So it's not a make or break, but what it is an opportunity for the public to really engage with art and for art to be a national conversation for French folks. Now, again, I said in the beginning that there are these academies that have very distinct notions of what is good art. I'm going to try to turn this. We're going to try to, let's find it because we're going to, yeah. Okay, well, don't worry, I'll get back on. Well, I think it'll come back on. Yeah, okay, don't worry, it'll work. So, this is, again, you always have slide rooms that are a little dark. And that's because we really need to unpack this painting. So I know Lloyd's presentation included a couple of David paintings, but Jacques-Louis David is one of the most celebrated academic painters of late 18th and 19th century Paris. Of course, as we have seen, he is one of the painters who's known for portraiture of Napoleon Bonaparte. If you're familiar with the Napoleon crossing the Alps painting, on horseback on this rearing horse, that's David. And this falls very much into that first genre of painting, the history painting genre. And it is a scene of, at the end of Socrates' life, the death of Socrates, when he is unwilling to surrender to an emperor. He's unwilling to give up on his principles. And so instead of declaring that he has made a mistake, he has instead decided to die by suicide by drinking hemlock. This is a really emotional moment, right? He's with all of his disciples. See, they're over here. There's Plato over here, in fact. And the only way that you know that this is emotional is because of their gestures. It has none of the same noise, none of the same vibrancy, the movement of even the painting the etching we just looked at of the salon, right? This is a really still image. And that's intentional because with what this is called is neoclassicism, this re-appreciation of classic Greek and Roman artwork and ways of rendering. You want to show the scene, but it's restrained, right? It's we are humans, but we are in control of our emotions. So we're not getting too emotional, even if he's in the middle of dying. Now, there's a couple other things. This is, again, a standard bearer for French art, and that's why I'm harping on this, even though it is quite a bit earlier than what we're going to be talking about primarily 2 years before the first French Revolution. Is that this is a huge painting. If you've ever seen it, it's at the Met in New York. It is literally 6 feet long. Like, it's enormous. You cannot miss it. It's tons of detail. And not only that, is there's this attention perspective. And what I mean when I say perspective is it is the two-dimensional rendering of three-dimensional space. It's something that's really challenging in painting because, in fact, you have 2 eyes. Many of us do. 2 eyes, and that really screws up when you're trying to display, okay, you have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. The objects change ever so slightly depending on which eye is looking. So you really have to understand what the human experience is in order to depict it in 3 dimensions. Now, we know that he's in this cellar, right? You can tell from the background with these cinder blocks, these chains, right, at the foot of these followers. But what David does very intentionally is he includes this little corridor, right, this little hallway, and he does this because what he's showing is his mastery of depicting space, right? He's saying I can do it just because I'm not doing it too much here. That doesn't mean that I don't have the capacity to do it. And as you see this painting, we're going to look at a detail. I don't know if you've noticed this, Socrates, you know, we know that he is an older man, right? He has white hair, he has a beard, but he goes to the gym, it seems. He's very fit. He has some pretty impressive shoulder muscles, right? He's doing his shoulder presses. And this is because this is also this idealization of the human, right? I don't want to see an actual older person. I want to see an older person who has aged very, very well. In fact, he looks like a Greek statue. Even this drapery that he has on his shoulder has the same Apollo Belvedere type of staticness, but also this sumptuousness of the material. You can really tell the difference. And what's amazing about David as a painter, and what academic painting in France does so well, is this attention to materials. Again, depicting sight as if you were actually in the room, depicting this experience. So you can tell that this material of the bowl or chalice with the hemlock is different from the drapery, is different from the beard, is different from his skin. We'll also point out the way that, this is an idealized scene. So he's in this dark dungeon, but he's just so happened to have this light coming in and shining right on him. And he's right in the middle of the scene. And that's all good. And so this is, again, painting in 19th century France, an academic painting, there we go. But how does this relate to architecture? So architecture is dealing with a similar neoclassical bent at this time, but it manifests a little different. First and foremost, attention to reproducing, again, Greek and Roman buildings, but better. But we don't want to tell you that it's better. We want you to sort of figure it out. And the idea with Greek and Roman buildings is that they have principles in them. That when you look at Greek and Roman structures, there is math, there's a rationality, and that rationality is beautiful. This is very different from everything Lloyd just talked about. Like the medievalism, shame of French architecture to the academics, right? They view it as unruly, they view it as too mystical, it's not mathematic, it is, but it's a very different set of principles than a neoclassical structure. So you are an architect, you are dealing with a similar set of training protocols, you study in a studio, you have mentorship, you are able to enter your drawings into the Prix de Rome or the Rome Prize, and if you win, you get to go live in Italy for 5 years with the other etchers and the painters and sculptors. Like painters, where you can, again, get acclaim on a much smaller scale. You only have so much space in France, right? Like, there's so much space to make a really monumental building. So you're dealing with a different set of priorities as an architect. And I will say that the architects do submit the drawings to the salon, but they are the least frequented rooms of all the rooms, right? Because people just don't. Reading architectural drawings is not as interesting as reading a 6-foot-long David painting, right? So let's just take a moment and look. How is this neoclassical? So first and foremost, you'll notice right away this grand entry point with these columns, this portico, this Greek pediment. And you'll also notice, like, we've got some garlands, we've got stone garlands, but it's restrained, right? It's really bare. In fact, it's just a big wall, right? There's nothing here. And you may think this looks like such an odd angle, right? Like, it looks wonky, and that's because this dome is enormous. Right, we talked about the neoclassical architects wanting to do what others have done, but better. And this is an example of this. The Pantheon originally was meant to be the Church of Sainte Geneviève, the patron saint of Paris. And while the revolutionaries were separating church and state, they decided to rename it the Pantheon as a tomb to the great men of France, the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. Now, what this means is, originally, when it was a church, light matters a lot, right? You have an experience, a spiritual experience with the divine. So flooding the church with light is a great idea. But as it becomes a tomb for the dead, that's less appropriate. So they think, okay, we're just gonna board up all of those windows. So that's part of the reason why there is absolutely no decoration on any of these walls. It lines up though with the aesthetic principles of neoclassical thinking, right? Because it's bare, you're seeing the structure, you're able to appreciate the brick and the stone that went into this structure. Now, the good news that they did that is because this dome, it turns out, is really big and it's really heavy. And there were a lot of concerns about the extent to which this building could actually hold this dome. The original Pantheon in Rome, if you've you don't even really see it, right? Like on the outside, it's like just a little bit on the top, and then you go in and you're like, oh great, there's this big dome. You can't see it. And then, you know, when they were building St. Peter's, they looked at that Pantheon. They said, we're going to do it better. Soufflot is looking at St. Peter's and saying, okay, we're going to do that, but we're going to do it better. And he's sneaky about this though, because although these academic architects refuse to acknowledge any brilliance of medieval times, there are certain innovations that happened in the Middle Ages that are very helpful for him here. One of those is the pointed arch. So arches in Roman times, right, they are very much a round half-circle arch. That is sort of one of the archetypical visual motifs and structural motifs of ancient Roman building. But once you get to the Middle Ages, it's all about these points here, these points that allow the cathedral to be much taller than it would have been otherwise. And the effect that Soufflot was trying to mimic was the way that when you're in a cathedral like Beauvais, this is one of the most celebrated medieval cathedrals, just from the way that it encompasses so many elements of medieval architecture. It's almost as if you're walking through a canopy of trees, right, with these pillars. It's so tall. Even the arches at the top, the way the ribbing makes it look again like branches coming out. He wants to create a similar aesthetic experience, but within this cathedral. Now, again, he's coming up against a lot of challenges because when you have really set types of buildings that you can, or angles and geometries that you can use, it becomes a lot harder to do that same verticality, that same reaching and experience. So what he does is he pretends like it's not there. He uses it. So one thing that happens is he includes these buttresses in the wall. They're the engaged buttresses, like somebody standing up against a wall, just to give it a little bit more width, a little bit more support, right? The buttresses being the key innovation of medieval times that Viollet-le-Duc was celebrated so much, because you can't build this tall in stone without extra structural support. The other thing, in order to get this dome, you'll notice that at the top, it looks circular, right? It looks like it's a circular dome, much like St. Peter's. And outside, oh, look at that, it has a point. So we're just gonna pretend like it's not there. We're gonna create a pointed arch, but we're gonna camouflage it. And so what that does is it takes advantage of the knowledge and the progress of previous eras in order to continue this neoclassical program without saying so, right? We're thinking strategically. It's not just do the same thing that everyone did before. To be French is, but do it better. So good news for you if you are an architect in the mid-19th century, because when Napoleon III, the, again, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, comes to power, he is very aware of the way that the city facilitated revolution. What do I mean by that? So there was the 1789 revolution, and then there was the 1830 revolution, and then there was the 1848 revolution. So he's coming to power in the 1850s, and he's like, my time is ticking. What do I do to make this not happen again? And you'll notice this is one of the pre-Haussmann or pre-renovated images of Paris. You have tons of material, tons of wood, and it's narrow, and there's these bridges, and there's sort of not very sanitary. And Paris was known for having these cholera outbreaks. So what he does, Napoleon III, is he couches this massive renovation of Paris under the guise of sanitation, right? We want to make the city cleaner. We want to make it easier to traverse. At this point, you also have railway stations coming into the city, much more traffic on foot and on carriage. And so we need to make sure that the city can accommodate all of these different people. But what it also does is it makes sure that you don't have these narrow little alleyways where people can pull down their houses to build barricades. Right? It's really easy to barricade 6 feet of alleyway so that troops can't come in. So you could, even in the Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, they're walking over these boulders that they have pulled down in order to facilitate the revolution. And so we see here he really just goes all out in cutting through the city like it's cake. There was some structure here in the past. There was this medieval belt that went, oh yeah, okay, yep, doing it. There was this medieval belt that went around the city from where Charles X, I believe, had established these tax collection stations. So, you know, you've got people coming into the city with bringing goods. You want to make sure you're making money. So there was some infrastructure that Napoleon III and his prefect of the Seine, Baron von Haussmann, were working with. But overall, you'll see that just like today, Paris it's like a plate of spaghetti, right? I mean, it was organic. Nobody was thinking we're going to have millions of people here one day. We're just sort of thinking about now. So these diagonal streets, they not only cut right through the city, but they cut through so that you can actually ease. There were a couple of boulevards, even this right here, this is sort of just one long straight line that goes from, this is the Arc de Triomphe, and it goes all the way down the Champs-Élysées, and like here's the Louvre and the Tuileries, and so we got this long road that everyone can go down. And it's so interesting because even at the time, there were guidebooks. People were remarking the way that this had an effect on the city. So one visitor to Paris said, see, tourism, the tourist, even in the 19th century, the stranger is almost invariably struck by the imposing streets. Picturesqueness has doubtless been sacrificed in the wholesale removal of the older building. The superior convenience and utility of these station thoroughfares is easily appreciated. That same question of, even with Notre Dame, we've always done it this way, and it's beautiful. I didn't want to do it, but it's working. And this question of how do we actually continue to innovate in the urban center? We'll see. He also builds these apartment buildings, which have been and still are the trademark visual infrastructure of Paris, right? Truly, it's like you have to know where you are from other landmarks because all of the buildings kind of look the same. I want to affirm to you, I have a PhD in architectural history, and there's still times where you really have to sit and like tell them apart, like really do a comparison here to see how distinct they are, because this building program was so regularized. What do we have here is a 5 to 6 story apartment building. Right? You have a ground floor that typically has shops or other types of places that you can bring in commerce. And then you have this large second story that is where the wealthy folks lived. Why would you want to live on the second story? Because you have to go upstairs, right? You don't have an elevator yet. So you live at the top and you are in this tiny little apartment. Great view, by the way, but tiny, like it's a box. And that's typically the person who supports the family, somebody who is a caregiver or domestic worker for the family on the second floor, so they can go up and down and up and down. Now, again, we think about the shapes, the neoclassical stripping down of architecture to everything except the essential, and that is certainly the case here, right? It is bare limestone, right? The material is speaking for itself. You have these ironwork grates that's adding a little bit of visual interest, but overall, it is a sort of uniform line of the same aesthetic over and over and over again. And this is very intentional, right? In fact, still to this day, you cannot build in France or in Paris any building that is higher than the Haussmann. You need to get a ton of clearances, and that's why even the Mitterrand Library at the Bibliothèque Nationale has to be outside of the city because it's going to be too tall, right? We can't put it in there. So if you can find space in Paris, you certainly have to align with the aesthetic that has already been set, this aesthetic precedent. We're going to keep seeing these apartments again and again, but I want to just, again, take a moment to pause there and what this looks like. So Napoleon III and Haussmann, their campaign to renovate Paris, it really took from this, right, these dank, dark, dirty streets, to this huge boulevard. And the other really remarkable thing about having the same aesthetic principle over and over again for these apartment buildings is that this looks endless. These are distinct blocks, right? There's alleyways in between them, but they look almost continuous because of the banding, right? Because of where the grates are, it looks like you're leading all the way up. Now, of course, you have much more room, right? It's really hard to barricade a boulevard, one. You are facilitating all of these new people coming in their carriages. Again, thank God, because with cars, this would be a disaster if they had not done this. Again, where do we sacrifice in order for the continued public good? These are moral questions that we as people who live in cities have to deal with. You'll also notice that there's attention to public works, so things like fountains, right? They add benches, they add trees, they have kiosks with newspapers. And what ends up happening is that you develop this culture of being out in being seen, right? Promenading. Like, I'm just gonna go for a walk, but I'm gonna get totally dressed up to go for the walk because you never know who you're gonna see or who I'm gonna run into. And so you need to look good all the time. And you wanna go out to be seen. You get dressed to go out and then come home. And that is the culture of this. And we're going to talk about the opera in just a second, but this again is this grand boulevard leading all the way up, this crown jewel of this, one of the anchor points of these boulevards, right? So it's not just building these apartment buildings, it's not just these thoroughfares, it's creating these massive monuments that can then stand on their own, but also enhance the existing framework of the urban structure. And so, Charles Garnier, he is one of the, again, most acclaimed, well-known academic architects of the 19th century. He does the studies that I described at the beginning of this session. He goes to Rome for 5 years. He does these recreations where you look at ruins and then you imagine what they would have looked like in ancient times. He proposes for his Prix de Rome these bathhouses. Again, always the architects are being asked to draw monumental buildings, right? We're not asking any architect of the state to think about shops or houses, right? Standalone houses. We're thinking about cathedrals. We're thinking about city halls. We're thinking about these massive works that the French government could then use. And that's because if you win the Prix de Rome, win that most impressive award, you are automatically an architect of the state when you get back, right? It's a one-way ticket to getting work. That doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily be super successful, right? You will just have a post for sure, right? There are many architects that have been lost in the annals of time because they didn't have the opportunities that someone like Charles. And so Charles Garnier, he enters into a competition to design the opera. He is given this sort of odd spot of a piece of land. I will say they had another architect that they wanted first, and they were like, well, let's just open it up. Viollet-le-Duc submits. He's not happy, right? I will say, having spent much time with both Charles Garnier and sort of butt heads a little bit, just I love the drama of the 19th century, right? It's like, who needs desperate housewives when you can read about historical figures? And he is lucky enough to get this commission. And why he gets this commission, it's a few reasons. So one is he is aligning himself with academic principles, but he is doing that thing again where he goes just a little bit beyond. He's like pushing it. It's a pushing, but it's enough to gain him notoriety. Now we saw in this last image this procession way up to the opera. If you've ever been to St. Peter's in Rome, there's a slight incline there, right? So the dome looks even bigger, and it's the same effect here. This long avenue that you have to walk up, and you're getting closer and closer. You know, great architecture. It dictates how you move through the space. There's a hierarchy of information you are meant to engage with, and so this is this very distinct route. He knew that he would have the space. He knew that the buildings would be there, the apartments. So he had to really think about, okay, so how do I design an opera be in conversation and not clash with this space. It is, though, the most over the top it could possibly be, still aligning with the aesthetic. So, you know, we have, let's talk about, right? This dome at the top makes a little triangle. We've got lots of columns. It's symmetrical. All these these are, you know, little portraits, these little moments of different great authors, great poets. You can't really see in this image, but there's stairs that you take to go up it. And what's amazing about this building is when you're on foot, it continuously changes and adapts, right? There's actually these two rotundas here, and he needed these rotundas. These are for the libraries. The archives of the Opera are in this rotunda here. You need this extra space, but you need to sort of put it out of the way, right? That's not the important stuff. So he does this, so you can't even really see it. Like, you really have to go sort of looking for it in order to find it. And what gets all of the pride of place is this masterful facade that is, again, slightly decorated, right? This is I always forget who's at the top. Hold on. It is, I have it on my thing. It's like it's like lyrics or something. It's like somebody, Apollo, who has a lyre, and that's who's up there. Again, pulling from classical Greek and Roman architecture. Yeah, but it's Apollo holding the lyre. That's what it is. Now, someone else is a lyre too, because this has a bunch of metal underneath it. So we talk about, again, adapting to what is conventions of the time aesthetically, of having this neoclassical building. But I want to use the technology that's available to us, and that includes having iron. But we don't want to show that we're using iron. And this is something Viollet-le-Duc was very intentional about, was he loved, like, yeah, if you're using iron, like, yeah, let it all hang out there. Yeah, just show everyone. It's great. This will be great for everyone to understand how masterfully we have adapted this new technology. That is not, again, this is not the academic way. So the same way that Soufflot is using pointed arches, he's using buttressing, the technology of the Middle Ages, in order to build his pantheon, Garnier is using modern technology, but he's pretending like he's not. Now, for those of you who have been to Paris, has anyone been to the Opera? Okay, so fewer number of people. So if you haven't been there, you're in for a little bit of a surprise, because, you know, you look on the outside, again, it's a lot of limestone, kind of feels like, you know, it's fine, it fits in with the environment. But then you go inside, and you're like, what? Oh my gosh, this is like, yeah, it's a lot. There's a lot going on here. Every surface is covered in some sort of ornamentation, whether it be the natural texture of the marble, whether that be a painting, whether that be some sort of sculpture. Lights in here, and his head from ceiling to floor absolutely covered in texture, in aesthetic, in storytelling. And what this ends up doing is creating the perfect backdrop for once again, the Parisians to see and be seen. So not only is the Opera very, very off limits to most people, it's only open, you know, once a week. You have to be an aristocrat or be someone very wealthy in order to even have access to this space. It's also in this really fashionable shopping district. You have these expensive perfumeries and shoe stores, and you know, Paris is well known for these textiles, and when the first what are those called? Department stores open, they are nearby. And so it's fashionable to be outside. It's fashionable to be out and to be seen. But if you go to the Opera, half of the point of being there is to be seen actually in the space, like to be so elite that you can be in this environment. And you have to necessarily but you can stand in these porticos and watch everyone else who comes up. This is known as being one of the most spectacular buildings of the 19th century, of course, because of the way it looks, but because it literally creates spectacle. The point of going to an opera is to see the opera, not here It's to go and to be seen, right? This is pre-influencer days. This is how you get your name out there. And what's even amazing is 30% of the floor plan in the entire opera is dedicated to this. Like, it's a third of the building. So this is a very intentional choice. I know that Princess Eugenie, the emperor's wife at the time, was very delighted. She said that it's not academic, it's the just a little bit different than the academic style that came before it. So this really challenging thing happens where, so Haussmann and Napoleon have, for all intents and purposes, demolished much of the city, right? They have been very intentional about creating these wide boulevards, these brand new apartment buildings. And then as Lloyd touched, from 1870 to 1871, you have the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune. And what ends up happening is that the Prussians shell the city extensively. And I'll show you a map, another map in a second, to see the extent of that damage. And then when the French government surrenders to the Prussians, and again, they sign the treaty in Versailles, and the Parisians are like, no, we're not done. We're not done fighting. And so ensues this 4-month commune where the Parisians declare their own government, and they pull off the city, and as the French military ascends or descends on the city, they're like, we're gonna burn it down. And I mean very seriously, they just start burning stuff down. They start taking this brand new city, this city that's meant to be the most modern in the world, and literally start burning it. And they're very intentional and self-conscious about this after the fact. So this is a map of, it's literally just Paris and its ruins. So this is, you think about a tourist who's come to the city, and you can literally see, this is what it used to look like, and then you find it on the map, and you're like, oh, that's what it's like now. But this is what it once was, and then here it is. And you know, there's so many affinities with Lloyd's talk about, okay, so we have all of these buildings, the Palace of Justice, for example, the Tuileries Palace. What do we do with these burned out husks of these shells of buildings that were once these great monuments to French art and architecture? And for many of these buildings, they sit there for like decades. This is something that is very near and dear to my own research, is what did Paris look like in the decades after the fact? Because we know that literally the Tuileries Palace sat there until the 1890s. So for 2 decades, every time you walked by this main thoroughfare that they have built through the city, and you see this shell of this building, these ruins, what is your impression of that? Like, how do you even understand that? And, you know, and my theoretical side of my work, I think a lot about even the way that Notre Dame, when it was on fire, it became the focal point. Everyone in the city knew that Notre Dame was there, right? It took up way more space than this tiny footprint of this singular building amongst a bunch of other buildings. But here is this moment where you have everything's on fire. And how do you even begin to, we had this medieval city, it was destroyed. Or for all intents and purposes, heavily renovated. We build up a new city. The Prussians destroyed it. We destroyed it. How do we move on from that? And this is a question I'm still grappling with very intentionally in my work. One of the ways that I've been doing this is mapping the destruction through ArcGIS. And what you just need to know is that if you can tell, the squares are different from the circles. The circles, orange are photographs that were taken of destruction. Orange indicates that I know 99% certainty where it was taken. Red is, that's my best guess. With the squares down here, these are, again, records of what Prussian shells hit apartment buildings. There's records of all of these things. And what this shows when you map it in this way is just that almost every single street in Paris was affected by 1870 to 1871. It was unbelievable. Even if you live in the poorest or the richest areas, affected by what happened there. And this really sets off, you know, another new opportunity for people to think about what is our art and architecture? What does it mean to us? How do we want to move forward? And we come across a revolution of another type. And if you are unfamiliar with 19th century Paris, you may not have expected to see today's lecture. And in which case, I'm so glad you're here because this is one of my favorite side prints. And the reason this is in here is because this is a different, again, type of aesthetic upheaval that happens. So we had the physical upheaval of 1870, 1871, but there are practices that are very much not French in art making and art practices. So Japan had been entirely disconnected from the rest of the world until 1853. They had a very strict closed-door policy, a lot of trade, they didn't do diplomacy, they were on their own, leave us alone, let us be. And in 1853, it's an American named Commodore Matthew Perry. He is, with his naval fleet, he needs supplies, and he says, let us in, we need supplies, otherwise we're gonna declare war. And so they're just like, fine. They let him in, but this ushers in a whole new exchange of art objects and practices that had never existed before. And one of the primary markets for Japanese objects and items is Paris. You have what is literally called Japan-a-mania. Now, why would an object like this be of so much interest to a French person? So first and foremost, right, we talked about David, and it is a long painting. It has a history of painting. It's smooth, it's permanent. This is a series of block prints. So number one, series of prints. It's not one image, it's 36, in fact. Second, there are multiple. It's not one singular object that is revered. You can get different copies. It is also small. It's flimsy. It's much more easy to damage. It's much more fragile than a painting. And from an aesthetic standpoint and an artistic practice standpoint, a formal way, let's just look at what we're seeing here. So number one, you have this view of Mount Fuji because it says it in the title. But like, that's all I get of Fuji. It's a line. It's a line, that's it. What you know, you all know this, right? Like when you're walking and your hands are full and you have your umbrella and you have your groceries and the wind just flips your umbrella inside out and you drop all your stuff. We can't see their faces. We don't know who they are. It is a totally quotidian scene. It's a totally just everyday scene. And it's also a little funny. Like it's a little like, it's sort of tongue in cheek. You have this person who's clinging for dear life to their hat and to their clothes, right? So they don't get naked in front of these other people, right? It's a bit dramatic that there's so much stuff flying around. There's not really a center focal point. He's like smack dab in the middle of the painting, right? Arguably, this tree could be the focal point, right? Because it's like in the foreground, but it's what we call truncated. So the tree is actually cut off at the top. It's not even in the whole frame. Now, I want to share with you something that really changed the way that I interacted with Japanese prints, and that is that we read always from left to right because we read in English. But Japanese prints are actually read from right to left. And that typically changes the drama of what the print actually is, right? You're coming in this way, you first see before you see any of these folks, these hats and these papers, and then you start to really unfold the scene before you. Now, I want to say what's really great about Japanese artwork and woodblock prints in particular that I really admire is that they rely on you to figure it out. So neoclassical artwork is like, I'm going to lay it all out for you, right? I'm going to make this as close to human experience as I possibly can. But Japanese woodblock prints, one, they don't have the space to do that. So a woodblock works is you have literally a block of wood, and you cut out the parts that you don't want visible, and then you ink what is the raised part of it. And what that means is you then have to take, every time you want another color, you have to carve another woodblock print and put it in the exact spot, right? It has to be really precise. So you don't actually have, the space to actually just add a bunch of color. You need to let the person looking figure it out for themselves. I should say that takes a lot of skill, right? This is not an easy thing to understand. It's just a very different way of making art than the Western tradition has dictated is accurate. And then of course, right, the woodblock print process, you're drawing, but it's so much more like a craftsman. You know, in the Western tradition, we view that as almost like a medieval artisan rather than actually just painting, where you're taking paint to brush and putting it on there. And so this opens up what is, again, this revolution we now look back on as Impressionism, this avant-garde movement of art and painting that took hold in the 19th century, the late 19th century. What is Impressionism? It is a series of exhibits. It has a very distinct time period, 1874 to 1886, of artists who were very much against what the Academy was doing, who said, this Davidian approach to painting is not for me. I want to have again, a different approach that is more a moment in time, that's more abstract, that's more individualized. I don't have to let every single detail come through. And themselves impressionists at first. They call themselves the Anonymous Society of Artists and Painters and Sculptors. And it's only after Monet, who we'll talk about in a moment, displays his impression Sunrise that they get the name Impressionist. It's a pejorative too. Because what we talked about in the beginning, those four genres, to be something that's worthy of elevation, it's worthy of being depicted and memorialized. If it's your impression on what your day was, like what you saw outside, like that, who cares? Who cares, right? These people you don't know, why would you paint them? That is the sort of the essential question. And things that this relating back to this piece about building Paris is that it is the urban center that facilitates Impressionist artwork. These new sites, this new mingling of classes, the new opportunities to be on the boulevards and be seen. So we think, for example, about Edouard Manet, and I'm very hesitant to include Manet even right after talking about Impressionism because he never actually exhibited with the Impressionists. So number one, not actually an Impressionist, knows all of these guys, right, and these people, these folks, but he is not actually technically an Impressionist. Comes from a wealthy family. They want him to go to the Naval Academy. He flunks out. They're like, try again. He flunks out again. And so instead they're just like, fine, whatever. And he goes and travels around Europe. He goes to Amsterdam. He goes to Spain. And this is important because he's really looking at a very different set of grandmasters. The Spanish grandmasters in particular are very impactful for how he creates art. It is not the same set of standards that others have seen. First and foremost, you'll notice that this is, again, it's a bit synthetic. And it's synthetic because it is like weird. The colors are weird, right? Like there's a harshness to the color. You look right away at these figures in the foreground. This like butter color, it's like buttercream. It's like really bright. It's like really clean. It's like really vibrant. And there's really very few colors in the painting overall, right? You have the green of the trees, moments of red interspersed throughout, and again this blue. But it's a very limited color palette. But it's not the muted Socrates. It's not the muted I'm in the dungeon Socrates. It's a different type of muting. It doesn't look like he's outside. It doesn't look like they're in this concert in the Tuileries. And the Tuileries concert is this really opportunity for all of these different classes to mingle together. For folks who maybe, again, would meet on the boulevard to go out and see each other, this public events happening throughout Paris. But where's the concert? Where's the music? It's not here. It's not even the people who are the performers. It's not even the performance. It's the folks who are hanging out in the Tuileries. Again, not something that people would have been used to painting, right? You're actually way more interested in what is the folie of the crowd, the craziness of the crowd, the energy of the masses, than you are about the actual performance happening in the Tuileries. Now, when we gave a close-up of Socrates, it was totally immaculate surface. And that was part of the issue that critics took with the Impressionists, because they said, you know, this is too much like a sketch. It looks too unfinished. This should never have seen the light of day or the public's eye. It is not worthy of being displayed. And I'll also notice that right here, you know, this is a close-up of these folks, like, this is kind of spooky, right? Like, this isn't a face. This isn't a face that you would see in any other portrait, right? This is not any person. This is Manet relying on your eyes to figure out what her face is supposed to look like. You can figure that out. He doesn't need to outline that for you so perfectly. You can do that as the viewer. I'll also point out that there are these folks in the front who are much more clean in their depiction. They have much more identity and figure to them, and that's because those are actually his friends. Like, these are folks that he's putting into the painting. He's hiding them in their like little Easter eggs. But these folks in the background, you know, they're in movement. You don't need to see them, but he doesn't know who they are, and he's just gonna, again, play with that and be loose with his brushstroke. Again, returning to this modern city view and Monet. Now, if you ever get Monet and Manet confused, I want you to know that they did in the 19th century too. So it's not your fault, because when Manet and Monet both submitted to the Salon and they both had their paintings accepted, Manet was very upset that he was being congratulated on Monet's artwork. And so we just you know, do what we can here. And Monet, he's older than many of the other Impressionists, and he is something of a father to them. He has been painting outside, this plein air painting, which is not new to the Impressionists. They get a lot of credit for doing that, but it wasn't them who did it first. But he's been doing that for a long time, and he's been sort of a rabble-rouser in the studio, atelier at the École des Beaux-Arts. And this is actually in the same quarter of the Opéra. It is in the same quarter where the it's in the spot in the Nadar's studio. Nadar, this photographer, where the Impressionist exhibits take place, but they don't take place another year. And what's amazing about this painting is, like, you know, you're walking through your house and you're like cleaning up and getting stuff done, and you glance outside and you keep going. That's what this looks like, right? It's like, oh, there's people out there, and you keep going. Right? There's so little detail. It is a glance. It is, again, an impression. It is a distinct moment, not in historical time, in quotidian time, of just lifetime, right? Something happening in your world. And so what we see here is he's looking down. This is and I want to make sure I make this very clear. When we were with Socrates, we were in the room, right? We were with him, we were on the ground. And what Japanese works do is they play with perspectival positioning. Very often they take what's called a bird's eye view, where it's like if you were standing up high and looking down, you would get this distorted perspective. And Monet has that here. And yes, he can actually see that. That's real. He's not imagining that he has that perspective. But what makes this important is you would have never seen this in the history of art otherwise, right? Like, you would have never even had the idea that you could actually look down on people in this way. We have this like very anonymous street, and what he does is he depicts the Haussmannian apartment just enough. Like, you don't need a ton of detail. If you know what you're looking at, you've been in Paris, you can figure it out. And he relies on you as the viewer to know that you are on one of these grand boulevards. You are seeing the carts, you're seeing the people, the mixing of classes. This is very likely a cold Parisian day. We were in Paris doing research in January. I do not in January. It was really cold and really gray, like way colder than we thought it would be, honestly. And that feels like this is January in Paris. Let's look at a little detail. I want to, you know, you look back, right? This is you have a minute, you take a step back, you look at the whole thing, it makes sense. But the thing about Monet is once you go up close, it's just little gestures of paint. And I want to emphasize this, and I can't emphasize this enough. It takes so much skill to do this. It takes so much skill to do what David was doing, but it also takes so much skill to say, I know what the human eye perceives. I know what is the minimum amount of information that a person needs to know that this is a person walking, right? That's a person walking. Little bit of feet, a little bit lighter here, right? You know there's head, there's probably, again, top hats, but it's just a little tiny bit. And what's amazing too, when you look at a Monet, is very often one little strip of paint, one color is what makes the difference. So even if we look here, if this carriage did not have this line of white and this line here, it wouldn't evoke the top of the carriage. Again, the light coming down, the cloudy light coming down, the sheen from where it hit the top, and then that's a wheel, right? It's like one little bit of white does the difference. It takes so much restraint, and you know, he's mocked senselessly for this. There is so much skill involved in this painting. Last but not least, and this was on for painting, I should say, is the Kaibut image. This was on your brochure, right? This was what we circulated as part of this, and this has long been one of my a painting that I always really admired, and then I saw it in person and I was really disappointed. And I say that because if you haven't noticed, again, I really love details. I love when you actually interact with an art object and it's different than what you anticipated. You go see a David, it's great. I mean, again, seeing a 6-foot tall painting or 6-foot long painting is monumental in its own right. Okay, so this is just like a detail. It's smooth, it looks exactly like it does. And this has that same smoothness. And the reason that it's theorized, I don't know if anyone's ever actually found proof of this, is that Caillebotte was working with photographs. And he was somebody who, again, had a bit more money. He lived in the Opera area, again, very, very fashionable, very wealthy area. And so that he was able to actually, again, take the photographs and then go back to his studio and paint from that image, right? You don't have that option until the late 19th century. Why do people think that? So first and foremost is if you get a detail, this is weird. Like, why are these people in a very different focus than this person here? Right? Like, this is a very crisp image. Like, again, even compared to Monet, what we were just looking at, he really is paying attention to the drapery of her gown. You can really tell the dimensionality. Again, even the shaping and the umbrella and the way the water's coming down. And then he's fuzzy. Like, this is not the JPEG. This is really what it looks like. So it's almost like, okay, he has one or the other, right? He either is doing this way more detailed in the background because he has a photograph and he's imagining it, and so it becomes naturally more detailed versus this person who is moving in the front. Now, going back again to how the similarities between this and Japanese prints, look at this weird angle, right? Like, are we crouching? Like, are we on the ground? Are we seated? Like, we're sort of looking up, but not really, the way that there's maybe a hill, but it doesn't really seem like there's a hill anywhere else in the image. They're cut off. Right? Like, who needs to see their feet? We can assume that they have feet. We can assume they're walking. Doesn't matter. Let's not take up any more space. Even this guy in the background, he's passing them just like half his body, right? Just cut it in half. We also have no sense of who any of these people are. Who are they? Don't care. What are they doing? Hanging out. Like, doesn't matter at all, right? They're anonymous going out in Paris. And one of the things that critics have said is this is a rather clinical view of the city because the way that these people aren't interacting. They're just sort of together, they're sort of stagnant, they're not really even engaged. Even these figures in the foreground are rather disconnected from what's going on around them. Now, I know I'm running out of time, and so I want to be mindful of that, but you cannot talk about the 19th century without talking about universal expositions. This is something that has been a through thread in my personal work. And essentially what happens is in London, in Britain, you have an industrial revolution that's going on. It's Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. They even say, we're not worried about a revolution. We're not worried about any upheaval. We're doing great. Let's show the world how awesome we've been doing. So let's have this massive convening of all of the works of our society, things like machinery and industry and technology. And let's bring in our colonies. Let's invite our friends across Europe to send displays and let us show the world how prosperous we have been. Now, this may remind many of you of a conservatory or greenhouse, and that's because Joseph Paxton was a greenhouse architect. Now, greenhouse does not fall under the heading of proper French academic architecture. Why would it not be that way? Well, number one is there are no columns here. There's symmetry. There's very minimal geometry. It is also easily reproduced. It is, in fact, built on site and then easily disassembled. And what he does here, in fact, is, in order to ensure that the workers who will be putting this together know how to put it together correctly, he color codes it. Like, it's so mass produced that he's like, great, we need 18, literally it's like blue rods and then yellow rods and then red rods. And you take the red and the blue and you make a thing and then put it with the other thing. I mean, it's great, but it's all industry. It is all science. It is all ahistorical. And so inside, this just gives you a very quick look of what it was like to be inside. Thousands, millions, I'm not exaggerating, of people visited the Great Exhibition. And you can see, again, the products from around the world. France was celebrated for their exhibit of ceramics, something they continue, and porcelain, which they continue to do well. But it gave people a sense of, again, the question of what is English, what is not English, what does blending look like? So the French, they're like, not to be outdone, we've been working really hard on this new city, we're gonna do one too. And what they do is they have exhibits in 1855, 1867, 1878, 1889, and 1900. So they're almost 12 years. Of course, Paul mentioned during the Q&A, the 1937 exhibit in Paris. They continue on, but those are the 19th century ones. And so this is not Jackson, right? This is, once again, how can we pretend that we are still in the neoclassical mode? Even if we're talking about the advances we've made as a society, as French people, we're still going to couch it in these arches, in these pilasters, in these columns, in these allegories of France and artwork. The one thing that the French do differently than the English is that they do have a section of fine art. And I say that because, again, at the beginning of the century, you really don't have an opportunity to engage with art very often, but as the century progresses, you have more museums, you have these World's Fairs, there's more opportunity, and they create the other salons for more access to artwork, and this was one of the places they did that. And I had to do that. I had to set us up because we had to get here, okay? We had to get here for this guy. So I've been harping on this over and over again, right? Like, classical architecture, stone. It is inspired by the Renaissance and the Greeks and the Romans. And so the 1889 exposition comes around. And 1889 is not just any exposition. It's the 100-year anniversary of the French Revolution. And it's been a long 100 years, right? We've had a lot of things happen. And so how do we show the world that we are on the up and up? We are at the center of industry and progress. We are going to build this tower. It was originally called the tower, the 300-foot tower of iron, right? It was only after the fact that they start calling it Eiffel's Tower. A lot of people are not happy about this. So in particular, Charles Garnier is a very harsh critic that why would we build this? They call it a scissor, right? Why would we put this scissor in the middle of the city? This isn't what we stand for. It is nothing except engineering. Engineering and construction is one thing I have not really talked about at all, because it doesn't matter if you're an architect, right? You're not building bridges. You're not building sewers. You don't need to know those things. You need to know the aesthetic. You are trained as a drawer. It's draftsmanship. Doesn't really matter. Somebody else can figure it out. You know math, right? You know that the building's going to stand, but you're not thinking about, again, these new materials, putting them on full display. This is what Viollet-le-Duc would have loved. This was Viollet-le-Duc saying, yes, let us take advantage of all of the advances we have made in the world to create this structure. It was never meant to be permanent. So many of the exposition buildings were not, and it just had such notoriety that it, again, has continued to stand as the standard bearer of French tourism, and even since then. And I will close, this is, truth be told, a little self-indulgent. I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't always feel the most confident in my academic prowess, but I can say with full confidence that I am the world expert on this exhibit at the base of the Eiffel Tower. Charles Garnier, I have spent more time and energy thinking about this exhibit than any other person alive today. And so Charles Garnier is commissioned to create this history of human habitations display, which again goes to what is French and what is not French. He does not pick this spot. He didn't want that spot. They ran out of space and they were like, just kidding, you're gonna be right next to this thing that you absolutely loathe. So that's an important point. He's not in conversation with the Eiffel Tower. But what he is doing is asking the question, okay, so we're now in this point of modernity. We're now in this point of industry where we're using these new materials. What is the role of history in that? What are we willing to? What does it mean to be French? And again, as this is a history of human habitations from around the world, he has houses from China, from Japan. Keep in mind, right, the French get 30 houses to talk about their lineage, and we'll just put Japan as one house, and that's the standard alone for that one culture, that one place. There's a lot of complications there, but the point is that this is an ongoing conversation. I mean, I'm so glad Lloyd went into the 20th century, because we're not done yet. But the point is that art and architecture themselves, they're not neutral. They're not just objects, they're not just buildings, they're not just utilitarian. They are, in fact, a real opportunity for artists, government officials, and even scientists to make a statement about what it means to be French and what it means to be in the 19th century. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kylie. We have a couple of minutes just for a question, and then we're going to move into a panel discussion. But let me see if, yes, Sam, you have a question? I'm going to run right up here with the microphone.
You're doing great.
Because we always want the people at home to follow along.
I think the third of impressionist that you showed, or after Monet, I forget his name, but it was the street scene in which the background was in much crisper than the foreground. It seems to me that the context is much more interesting than this couple. The couple is not particularly interesting at all, and that seems very consistent with Japanese art, in which the whole, the aggregate, is more important than any discrete feature of it.
I love that point. And I love that point because it also, you're bringing up, even though these buildings themselves too are also a bit anonymous, you can pinpoint this exact spot in Paris. I don't remember which place it is, but you can go there. But it's indistinct, and it's even in the way of Japanese art, where it's the same thing over and over again for different angles, and it is Mount Fuji that becomes the thread throughout, having these different, again, almost identical apartment buildings in all of these different artworks. Is very much this duplication of the same thing over and over again. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have time for let's do one more
Sorry, I
question
talked
over
too
here,
much.
and then
I'm
we're
sorry.
going to go into a panel discussion, and we can follow up with more questions.
Just a quick question. What happened to the Garnier building that were at the foot of the Eiffel Tower?
I'm so glad you asked this question. So number one is that most of them were, they were disassembled. Purportedly, there is one in a French suburb called Neuilly-sur-Seine. Okay, it's about 40 minutes out of Paris. And my 24-year-old self, with this dumb briefcase and these dumb shoes, who is not a practical person at all, was like, I'm gonna go find this Scandinavian pavilion. So I traipsed around, I don't have GPS, I can't find it. Theoretically, there is one that still exists, but my understanding is the rest of them were auctioned off. So that's the hard thing about exhibit buildings, is very often they were disassembled for their raw materials. However, Joe, that does not mean that there aren't other things related to the buildings. So the World's Fairs themselves are just this, again, massive tourist attraction, and there's so many souvenirs from the expos. What was amazing about Garnier and his exhibit was each of these houses was inhabited by a costumed actor. And you could meet the costumed actor and you could buy things, like in the Egyptian house, you could buy a mummified cat. Or you could go into the Scandinavian house and they would cook you food. And so you have that, and then you also have things like postcards. I have in the process of collecting a commemorative plate series of these. And the reason I bring this up, and I'm so excited about this, is because you're totally bringing this up, yet they're ephemeral architecture, right? They are never meant to stand permanently. They get taken down, but they have such a long lifespan in the cultural imagination after the fact. So I will once again, maybe, and hopefully in future years, go back to Neuilly-sur-Seine with better shoes and sunscreen, and I will try to find this house, but not yet.
It really is amazing to think that Garnier, the person who developed the opera, was overwhelmed by Eiffel, built the Eiffel Tower. But Garnier landed on his feet because the opera is still there too.
Yeah, that's true.
Kylie, thank you. I want to open up more questions, but let's take a short break and we'll move into a panel discussion. But thank you. I think we can see why French art is so important.